Kitaro Nishida, Goethes' metaphysical background. Time is a flowing, from eternal past to eternal future. Time is, so to say, born in eternity and disappears in eternity. Everything revealed in history has its form and figure on such a background of eternity. Seen from the point of view of history, everything is connected according to cause and effect, and flows from eternal past into eternal future. But time, as self-determination of the eternal now, is essentially contained in this now. There where time is, contained and distinguished, personality appears as content of eternity. This is true for all forms of civilization, but art is especially something formed by history on the background of eternity. Just as Michelangelo's unfinished sculptures or the sculptures of Rodin are hewn out of a massive block of marble, so is all great art a relief cut out of the marble of eternity. This may appear as something impersonal compared with a particular element, but it is not something that, like matter, is the opposite of form. It is, but in this background and through it, that something personal has been formed. Without such a background, there is nothing personal whatever. Michelangelo's block of marble is not mere matter. It is, in itself, already an essential part of art. Just as our mind sees itself in itself, the personal is an image of eternity, mirrored in eternity. Any kind of art has essentially such a background, and that which does not have such a background cannot be called art. According to the varying relationship between this background and that which has been formed in it, different personal content is visible, and different artistic content is formed there. Oriental art is essentially impersonal, because the background is an integral part of it. This produces, in our hearts, a formless, boundless vibration and an endless, voiceless echo. Western art, however, is formed through and through. In Greece, where the eidos was thought to be the true being, plastic art is so completely formed that it would be impossible to add to its beauty of form. Still, we have the feeling that some kind of depth was somehow lacking in Greek art. Eternity, in the Greek sense, stands before us as something visible, and does not embrace us from the back of things. In Christian culture, where the personal element is recognized as true being, art gains in depth and background. Early Christian art has an inwardness which reminds us of Buddhist paintings in the East. Later, in the art of Michelangelo, there is such great vigor that we have the feeling of standing in front of a deep crater's turbulent black flames. His art has a powerful depth and a colossal background. What is it that forms the background in Goethe's poetry? Out of what kind of marble block is his art cut? If one imagines the background of eternity as space, one can distinguish a two-dimensional and a three-dimensional background, a formless one and a formed one. And with regard to the background of three dimensions, one can distinguish height and depth. Then the background of the plastic art of Michelangelo must be called deep. In his art, there is a vigorous force rising from the depth of an abyss. On the other hand, one feels in Dante's Divina Commedia a height to which one must look up. In this background, there is the transcendent Christian God. The background of Goethe's poetry is not three-dimensional. It can be imagined as two-dimensional and can be called formless, for example, without form or figure. Of Eastern paintings, we use terms like high-wide, deep white, and plain white. But that which I have called two-dimensional is height without height, depth without depth, and width without width. Such an art which has in its background something that extends infinitely without form is in danger of negating the human element. The infinite, which merely denies the finite, is imagined as dark fate, incompatible with humanity. But that which forms the background of Goethe's poetry is not such a two-dimensional background. On the contrary, there is everywhere something that encloses the human element, and nothing that denies it. Humanity is quasi-dissolved in this background, but this dissolving does not mean a loss of individuality. The sound of true human individuality is to be heard only where there is such a background. This background is like a Resonanzboden of humanity. Could it not be said that the background of Rembrandt's paintings has such significance? There is depth in his paintings, but it is a completely different type of depth compared with Michelangelo. It is not force, but softness. It is not the depth of force, but the depth of feeling. Verhaeren says at the end of his book Rembrandt, page 120, Il recueille les pleurs, les cris, les joies, les souffrances, les espoirs au plus intime de nous-mêmes et nous montre le Dieu qu'il célèbre, agité des mêmes tumultes que nous. This God is something like a sounding board of humanity. Speaking of soft depth, one might be reminded of Leonardo da Vinci, but Leonardo is intellectual. The smile of Mona Lisa is mysterious, but it is not the smile of love. The relationship between Goethe and the philosophy of Spinoza is well known. Goethe narrates how he, in his early youth, kneeled before the throne of nature. After having read Spinoza's Ethica, he was charmed by the doctrine, and never gave it up throughout his life. Goethe thought of all as one, and nature as God, and his rather contemplative philosophy of life was based on this. So he has a fundamental tone in common with Spinoza's pantheism. But Goethe was less a Spinozist than he himself believed, and less than many have said since. From a different point of view, one could even say that he took the opposite standpoint. In Spinoza's philosophy, eternity is two-dimensional, but negating the individual. Spinoza's substantia negates the individual completely. In his philosophy, the individual is merely a modus of the substantia. There is nothing like time, and his philosophy does not allow for anything like individuality. Spinoza's natura is a nature of mathematical necessity. Though he negated the Jewish theism, his Jewish peculiarity is shown by his monism, and in the consistency of his strict logic. On the other hand, Goethe's pantheism encloses individuality everywhere. Nature, in Goethe's sense, does not deny individuality, but produces something individual everywhere. This nature is like an infinite space which, itself formless, produces form everywhere. Like the moonlight in An den Mond, like the sea in Der Fischer, and like the mist in Erlkönig. Goethe's nature is essentially something that harmonizes with our heart. River, flow along vale, without rest or peace, murmur to my silent tale, whispering melodies. There is Mitklingen in the very depth of our soul. While Spinoza's nature is essentially mathematical, Goethe's nature may well be called artistic. While Spinoza is Jewish, Goethe may well be called Christian, especially a Christian South German. Goethe, whose long life of more than 80 years was completely given to the joy and pain of emotion, was totally different from Spinoza, whose life was spent in his room in loneliness, while thinking and polishing lenses. Goethe is similar to Leibniz in as far as he, too, emphasized individuality. He agreed with Leibniz's monad and with Aristotle's concept of entelechy. Unlike Leibniz's windowless monad, Goethe's monad makes it sound and fades boundlessly away into the distances of eternity. All this must be the reason why Goethe, despite his various talents and manifold activities, was the greatest lyrical poet. In the field of drama, where form and figure is essential, the background must be three-dimensional. Only with regard to lyrics does one not know from where it comes and to where it goes. It is an overflow of the spring of life. There is nobody but Goethe in whom the personal experience has become poetry so directly. He sings, "All in life repeats again, joy and woe becomes refrain." So his poetry is the immediate expression of his unusual experiences. He himself confesses in the poem An die Günstigen, "Non confession like in prosa, but we oft confess sub rosa. In the Muses' silent grove, how I erred and how I strived, what I suffered, how I lived, Flowrets in a bunch are here." And his Tasso says, "Und wenn der Mensch verstummt in seiner Qual, gab mir ein Gott zu sagen, was ich leide." It is his lyrical poetry which touches us the deepest. Lyrical art is the formless voice of life. It needs no saying that poetry is originally and essentially a product of intuition, and that intuition is the essence of the poet. This is especially true of Goethe. To him all being becomes the object of intuition. He warns the physicist, "Natur hat weder Kern noch Schale, alles ist sie mit einem Male." And in Epirema he says, "Students of nature, make this your goal. Heed the specimen, heed the whole. Nothing is inside or out. What's within must outward sprout." Even his biological studies and his theory of colors, though scientific research, are based on the vigor of his artistic intuition. In this there is a touch of Platonism, one might say. Already in his youth in Strasbourg, Goethe has a longing for Raphael and classical antiquity, but his Italian voyage, as everybody knows, had the greatest influence on his art. This is obvious from the difference between Tasso or Iphigenie and Goetz or Werther. And is there not something in his concepts of Urtier and Urpflanze that reminds us of Plato's idea? In the second part of Faust, Faust must descend to the realm of the mothers in order to be able to conjure Helena. The beautiful Helena scenes show Goethe's longing for the classical world and are necessary stages of Faust's development in his continued endeavor towards a higher existence. But it was merely a stage, not the goal. When Faust embraced Helena, only her veil and robe remained in his hands. He returned home and turned to an active life, for the benefit of society. Goethe was thoroughly Germanic in his essence. The Goethe who wrote the second part of Faust and the Wanderjahre was still the author of Goetz and Werther, although he was touched and refined by the spirit of the classical world. In the depth of his soul there was not the clarity of eidos, but a depth of feeling, to which the vision of ideas was not sufficient. Mere feeling tends towards mysticism, but Goethe was not Novalis. In Goethe, eidos is heart, and heart is eidos. There is no inside or outside. Everything is an open secret. Moreover, and above all else, Goethe's ideal was, as shown by the second part of Faust and by the Wanderjahre, action for the community of men. Faust's last words are, "Then might I say, that moment seeing, Ah, linger on, thou art so fair, the traces of my earthly being can perish not in aeons, They are here. In the beginning of the drama Faust, God says, "Es irrt der Mensch, solang strebt." And at the end, the angels say, "Wer immer strebend sich bemüht, den können wir erlösen." Goethe, the great poet, was not striving for enjoyment of beauty, but the earnest endeavor in life. Prometheus shouted, "Cover thy spacious heaven, Zeus, with all clouds of mist. Thou must my earth let standing here. I know naught purer under the sun than your gods." And he finishes with the same vigor of life. "Here sit I, forming mortals after my image, a race resembling me, to suffer, to weep, to enjoy, to be glad, and thee to scorn, as I." In Goethe himself there was originally something Prometheus-like, something titanic. His whole life was a life of noble action. He lets Faust say, "Werd ich beruhigt je mich auf ein Faulbett legen, so sei es gleich mich getan." Even Goethe's resignation, Entsagung, was an active one. Man can find salvation only by acting. In this respect, Goethe reminds us of Fichte, who called indolence the hereditary sin of man. But in the depth of his personality there was nature and not moral obligation. The blind desire, the impatient will, the restless thoughts and plaints are still. We yield ourselves and wake in bliss. Here is something that reminds us of the English poet Browning. The years at the spring, the days at the morn, mornings at 7, the hillsides dew-pearled, the larks on the wing, the snails on the thorn, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. Browning's last words were, "One who never turned his back, but marched breast forward, never doubted clouds would break, never dreamed, though right were worst, wrong would triumph. Held we fall to rise, are baffled to fight better, sleep to wake." However, that which stands behind Goethe is not the same as in the case of Browning. That which is standing behind Goethe and closes action is salvation. In the background of the Promethean Goethe glitters the moonlight. "Bush and vale thou fill'st again with thy misty ray, and my spirit's heavy chain castest far away. Thou dost over my fields extend thy sweet soothing eye, watching like a gentle friend over my destiny." In this background whispers a friend's voice, narrating what wanders through the labyrinth of our hearts, unknown to man. And in Faust, the chorus mysticus reveals Goethe's metaphysical background in saying, "All earth comprises a symbol alone. What there never suffices, as fact here is known. All past, the humanly, wrought here in love, the eternal womanly, draws us above." It is not an eternal male, as in the case of Browning, but the eternal female. Goethe's universalism does not, like Spinoza's, reduce everything to the one substance, denying man. He sees all things in man, and still each thing is not a substance, and indestructible as in Leibniz' monadology. According to his words, "Im Grenzenlosen sich zu finden, wird gern der Einzelne verschwinden." The individual will willingly disappear in order to find itself in the infinite. The individuals are absorbed in the universe without any pre-established harmony between them. When Goethe says in the second part of Faust, "Am farbigen Abglanz haben wir das Leben," we have life in its colorful resplendence. There is something of Platonism, but since he is Germanic, his world is a world of action, and not a world of intuition. Resignation is resignation through action. In the depth of the world of action is salvation, and not, as in the case of Kant or Fichte, moral obligation. According to the words enträtseln sich den ewig Ungenannten, solving for himself the riddle of the eternally unnamed. In the Marienbad elegy there is something like a friend's eye or a friend's voice, consoling our soul. But still, figure and form do not disappear in the rhythm of emotion, as in Novalis. For Goethe there is no inward and no outward. Everything is as it is. It comes from where there is nothing, and goes where there is nothing. And just in this coming from nothingness and going into nothingness, there is the gentle sound of humanity. Yes, Goethe's universalism is just the opposite of that of Spinoza. His philosophy of life, based on this kind of universalism, does not remind us of the intellectual love of the Stoic sage, but of the love of Maria, the eternal womanly. Verheeren said that the medieval man wanted to come nearer to God by naivete and candeur, but Rembrandt by souffrance, angoisse, tendresse, and joie, i.e., by a full human life. Is it not the same with Goethe? In this he resembles Rembrandt more than Spinoza. Proceeding in this direction, we reach something like an art of sadness without the shadow of sadness, an art of joy without the shadow of joy, as we see in the art of the East. To Goethe, the man who sought liberation from Werther's sufferings, Rome gave the Roman elegies. To the old Goethe, who sought liberation from reality, the Orient gave the westöstlichen Divan. History is not only flowing from the past into the future. True history is a counterflow to the movement from the future into the past. It is eternal rotation in the now. When history is regarded as extinguished in the eternal past, something like the Greek civilization appears, and it takes everything as a shadow of eternity. On the other hand, when history is regarded as going to and disappearing in the eternal future, something like the Christian civilization appears, and it takes everything as a road to eternity. When, however, history is thought of as determination in the eternal now, where past and future are extinguished in the present, then everything comes without a whence in its coming, and goes without a whither in its going, and that which is eternally what it is. Such a thinking flows in the depth of the civilization of the East, in which we have grown up. Written in December 1931.